28th of October of this year.
Yes. Mr. Maseko's supplementary affidavit dated the 4th of September 2019, as well as his other affidavit and whatever annexures are attached thereto will be marked NN1.
Thank you, Chair.
Before you proceed, Ms. Hofmeyer, I think there probably is something that I should sort out here. I hear you when you speak the way I should hear you, but I also have some, I don't know if I should switch something off here. I hear you through something else.
Oh. Chair, possibly some assistance can be given.
Yes.
Should we maybe adjourn for a few minutes to sort it out for you?
Well, maybe the assistance will be quick.
Great. Let's hope.
Just speak again so he will hear what's happening.
Yes. Today we have the evidence of Mr. Maseko,
or maybe that should be taken
who is returning to give evidence for a second time.
Fine. Yeah, the assistance was quick and effective.
Excellent.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, if we may then proceed, and Mr. Maseko, I was covering the fact that you had previously been a witness before the Commission in August of last year. And since that evidence, the Commission has undertaken further investigations. There have also been further witnesses who have provided affidavits and who will be testifying before the Commission. And some of the subject matter that those witnesses cover relate to the evidence that you gave in August of last year. And so we have sought your return to the Commission in order to close off certain aspects of the evidence that you gave based on further investigations that the Commission has done, as well as to have your response in relation to certain witnesses who have either given affidavits and or will be giving oral evidence in due course. So that is just to frame the background to your evidence today. If I may then commence with the first topic, and it's a topic that you were asked to address in one of the affidavits that you've placed before the Commission. I'd like to take you to both of those and just have your confirmation of a point I made earlier, because your first affidavit you'll find at page 1 of Exhibit NN1. Do you see that?
I see it.
And you'll see that your signature appears a signature appears at page 8. Can you confirm that that's your signature?
That is indeed my signature.
And this was an affidavit you deposed to, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, if you go over to page 13 of the same exhibit NN1.
Yes.
You'll see a document there. Can you read for us what the title is of that document?
Well, the title says, Statement by Themba James Maseko in response to the statement made by Mr. Maringe Richard Malloy.
Indeed, and then if you go over to page 23, which I take to be the last page of that document, is that correct?
Yes, I got it, yes.
Is that your signature?
That is indeed my signature.
And it appears to have been deposed to before a Commissioner of Oaths, is that correct?
That's correct.
So it is in fact also an affidavit. You don't have any difficulty with that.
It is an affidavit.
Can I just confirm then for the record, the facts set out in both of these documents, the one appearing and commencing at page 1 and the one appearing and commencing at page 13, are those facts true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge, they're true and correct, yes.
Thank you. Since the evidence you gave in August of last year, Mr. Maseko, former President Zuma has testified before the Commission. He did so in the week of the 15th of July of this year. And one of the things that you were asked to provide to the Commission in your second affidavit is a response to Mr. Zuma's evidence. Do you recall that?
I recall that, yes.
And it actually commences at page 5 of NN1.
I got it.
Do you see at paragraph 8 there? You
Yes.
have a heading, comment on former President J.G. Zuma's evidence at the Commission.
I see that, yes.
What I'd like to do this morning is take you through some of the important aspects of his evidence insofar as your former evidence is concerned, in order to have your response to it and also to have your assistance in relation to certain matters that have been uncovered in the further investigations of the Commission. So if we can start with Mr. Zuma's testimony. Mr. Zuma's testimony before the Commission included that he denied that he had instructed Minister Shabani to remove you from GCIS. Chair, I don't suggest we go to the transcript all the time, but in the course of the questions, I'm going to make reference to the transcript and where that testimony can be found, just for the purposes of the record.
That's fine.
Where it's pertinent for us to look at particular wording, I may well then go to the transcript, but this is not such a case, unless, Mr. Maseko, you feel the need to do so. But for the record, that is in the transcript of the 16th of July 2019 at page 25. Now, you do take that up in the course of your response. Can you tell us today what your response to that evidence of Mr. Zuma is?
The question was whether the deployment of Directors General is discussed with the President, and that's covered in paragraph 10 of page 23 of the transcript. And in my response, I say that I do agree with the former President that the deployment of Director Generals is discussed with the President with a view to seek his approval, and I'd like to underline the word discussed. However, as far as I'm aware, Cabinet did not get involved in deployment and transfer of serving Directors Generals. And that's because my understanding is that there's a discussion between the two ministers, releasing and receiving minister and the DG concerned. If there's agreement, then there's consultation with the President, and the matter is discussed to seek the President's approval. And if there's agreement by all those parties, then the transfer is effected.
Thank you. And if we go over the page to page 6, at paragraph 8.3, you deal with the particular testimony of former President Zuma about whether he had instructed Minister Shabani to terminate your contract. You record there that the former President's evidence was that he had never instructed Minister Shabani to remove you from GCIS, and it was in fact Minister Shabani who had asked that he be transferred from GCIS because, and then you're quoting there from the transcript, this is the evidence of Mr. Zuma, I think there was an issue between them. Can you give us your response to that evidence?
My response is very clear. I think what the former President says in his oral evidence is untrue. There was never an issue between myself and Minister Shabani. We had a very solid relationship. And the way Minister Shabani conveyed the message to me demonstrated that, in fact, he himself was shocked by the turn of events. So the suggestion by the former President that there might have been an issue between me and Minister Shabani, I dispute, Chairperson.
Thank you. Chair, you might recall, in the course of Mr. Maseko's evidence in August of last year, you raised an issue about the nature of the working relationship and whether there'd been any performance assessments of Mr. Maseko. At the time, we undertook to investigate that further, and we do have a relevant document. Mr. Maseko, for this purpose, I'm going to ask you to go to the bundle that should be in front of you, NN5. Chair, if I may explain the origins of NN5. There are a series of witnesses who will present evidence over today and tomorrow. NN5 comprises a series of documents that have been put together in preparation for today's evidence. It, as matters currently stand, is in fact not a complete file. There have been engagements over the course of the end of last week and the beginning of this week in order to obtain the final documents that are required to complete the file. As matters currently stand, it is still incomplete because there is an important affidavit that we are awaiting for from the Director General of the Department of Public Service and Administration. So this file is not complete until that is added to it.
Yes.
Chair, I will update you in the course of the day about the efforts that are being made to obtain that affidavit and have it available to us for the hearing today.
Yes.
But nonetheless, there are certain documents already contained in this file that I propose to take various witnesses to. There may be occasions where the witnesses have not seen these documents before or recently. And where that is the case, it's my suggestion that we give the witness the full opportunity to consider it. If it's a lengthy document and there's a need for a few moments to do so, my suggestion would be that we enable that to take place. But for present purposes, if we could enter this as Exhibit NN5 into the record, because I will make reference to it throughout today's evidence.
The liver arch file containing various documents, starting with a letter signed on 31 August 2009 by Minister of Labour, Mr. M.S. Mdlalana, will be marked as Exhibit NN. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Maseko, if I could ask you to turn up page 156 in Exhibit NN5.
I got it.
Is that a document?
156,
Chair.
156. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Maseko, have you seen this letter before?
Chairperson, I've not seen this letter before.
Can you tell us who it is from and who it is to and what its date is?
The letter is dated the 6th of December 2010, and it's directed to the Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Corporate Services of GCIS, Ms. Pumla Williams, and it is a performance assessment of Mr. Themba Maseko. Do you want me to read what the letter says? It's just one sentence.
If you will do that in a moment, just to confirm who wrote the letter.
The letter is from Minister Collins Chabane, who was Minister in the Presidency at the time.
And then just before you get to the content of the letter, I want to locate this letter in time. It's dated the 6th of December 2011. When were you removed as Director General of GCIS?
It was in February 2011.
Thank you. If you can then tell us what the letter records.
I'm sorry, Ms. Hofmeyer, I think you said 6 December 2011.
Apologies.
It's 6 December 2010.
All of my colleagues have alerted me to the fact of that error. I'm indebted to you as well, Chair. So it's dated 6 December 2010. I have your evidence that you left GCIS in February 2011. So correct me if I'm wrong, it's this December preceding your departure from GCIS.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. If you'll tell us what the letter records.
It starts off by saying your letter, meaning Ms. Williams' letter, dated 26th October refers, after consultation, I've taken the decision to take into consideration the panel's decision and analysis of Mr. Maseko's performance assessment for the period 2008-2009 and agree with the panel score of 114%. I recommend a pay progression for Mr. Maseko's overall performance.
Can you assist us with a score of 114%? Is that a good or a bad score?
I'm happy with it.
You're happy with it? Good. Can you confirm whether you got the pay progression after that letter?
I'm sure I did, but I can't recall if the payment was made.
Thank you. I'd then like to return to the next aspect of former President Zuma's evidence?
Maybe before you do
Certainly,
so, Ms.
Chair.
Hofmeyer, and once again to tie up with whatever I may have asked about performance last time. Now, you said you had not seen this letter before. Is that right?
I may have.
You may have, but you can't remember.
I can't remember this.
Yes. Now, was the practice that you would get to know how a panel assessed your performance in any particular year? In other words, would you get to know this is the score they gave to my performance?
Yes, Chairperson. Normally, the panel sits, does a performance evaluation. You get interviewed. They look at whatever documents you present. Then the head of HR would then communicate to you in writing to say this was your score, and this will be the bonus that you're entitled to. But the communication will be from the head of HR or corporate services that communicates. So the minister reports the findings of the panel to HR, HR reports to the employee.
Yes. So before the issue of a performance assessment is finalized, does the minister have to indicate whether he accepts or she accepts the score given by the panel, or is the position that once the panel has given the score, that is the score and whatever the minister says? So what is the role of the minister, or what is the status of the minister's response? What is the status of the score given by the panel?
Well, the minister is the supervisor of the Director General. So the minister sits and is part of the panel. So is part of the decision. Once there's agreement among panel members about the performance, then the minister signs off and agrees and says, this is our recommendation.
Yes, okay.
So he's part of the decision.
Okay, so the minister would be part of the panel that assessed that would assess a Director General's performance.
That is correct, Chairperson.
Yes. Now, this particular score relates to a performance assessment for 2008/2009. Would the performance assessment relate to a financial year?
It relates to a financial year, yes.
It relates to a financial year. So this would have been for the period March 2008 to end of February 2009, more or less.
More or less, yes.
Yes. Okay. And by the time would this be the last performance assessment that, as far as you remember, was conducted in regard to your performance before you left?
That is
GCIS.
correct. That is correct, Chairperson, yes.
Now, the score that was given in regard to this one is 114%. That seems to be quite a very high score. Now, we might not be having letters relating to other years, but you might be able to remember how other years, the scores you got in maybe the previous 2 or so years, how that may have compared with this score. So if you are able to remember, even if it's an estimate, that would be helpful.
Chairperson, unfortunately, I'm sure we can get the records from GCIS.
Yes.
I can't recall, since this was quite a number of years ago.
Yes.
But all I can confirm is that there has never been a year where I got a negative allocation of marks, of points.
Yes. A negative would start from when? Below 50 or what?
Well, it would be below 100%. So.
Oh.
So if I'm performing according to standard, it will be your normal 100%, but...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you must explain something. When the score here reads 114%, that says to me, and I would imagine it says to other people who might not be familiar with public service performance assessments, it says to me, this person did beyond 100%. Is that a correct understanding of it?
Yes, there's a formula, a calculation of points. So there are objectives that are set,
Yeah.
and numbers are allocated to that formula. So let's say human resource management or ability to manage your budget effectively. So a number of points will be allocated to that, and then there will be goals for the year in question, and those are things that are agreed to with your minister as your supervisor. So at the end of the period, we then go through that performance agreement, and then points are allocated. So if you, let's say for management of the budget, there's a point of 60, and you get 59 points out of that. So then they add all the numbers, and then you, at the end of the calculation, you're given a score. So if the allocation here says that the performance is 100 and, what is it?
114.
114%. It clearly indicates that you have exceeded the standard that you had agreed to with your minister. So it's...
Yes. But
it would, I think they allocate excellence, 100%, good, beyond 100%, it will be excellent, or whatever, I can't remember.
Yes, but can I just confirm this? When I look at 114%, I'm kind of thinking of a student who is doing an exam, and the highest they can get is 100%.
Okay.
So if it's 114%, it seems to me to be, I don't know what it is. So maybe whoever is doing the score says, you know, this student is not enough to give him 100% because he is actually more than that. So, but I want to check whether I'm correct in understanding it that way, or whether there's something that I don't understand.
I think the message we could get out of that number is that performance was exceptional.
Exceptional.
It exceeded all expectations.
All expectations.
Yeah. And that's where then it raises issues about the possibility or likelihood of your supervisor saying, I'm happy with you.
Yes. Yeah.
And when the contract comes to an end, these would have been factors taken into account to determine whether the contract is extended or not extended.
Yes.
But 114% exceptional.
Okay, so, but what you also said earlier on, as I understand it, is you never had an occasion when you got less than 100%. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yes. At GCIS.
At GCIS, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Maseko, if we can then go to a second aspect of Mr. Zuma's testimony. His testimony on the 16th of July, and this can be picked up in the transcripts at pages 23 to 25, and then again at page 28. His evidence was that it was a decision of Cabinet to transfer you from the position as DG of GCIS to the position of DG at DPSA. And I'd like, if we may, to explore that a bit. But before we get to it, I'd like your assistance on some background about Cabinet decisions and what the minutes of a Cabinet meeting will record in relation to those meetings. Could you first, for background, explain to us what experience you have of Cabinet meetings?
The decision-making in Cabinet is as follows. A department or a minister that wants a decision to be taken by Cabinet on a particular matter, they generate what is known as a Cabinet Memorandum, and the Cabinet Memorandum will summarize the issue, the reasons for that decision to be made. It will also make recommendations about what exact decision Cabinet needs to take. Such a Cabinet Memorandum is then tabled ordinarily in front of a Cabinet subcommittee, which is a Cabinet subcommittee that sits before a formal Cabinet meeting. The Cabinet subcommittee and government is divided into different clusters. I think there would be, if I recall, about 5 or 6 such Cabinet committees. So the Cap memo is then debated and discussed at the level of a Cabinet subcommittee. And then when there's agreement in the Cabinet subcommittee, the matter is then put on the agenda of a formal Cabinet meeting. And the Cabinet will then go through the contents of the Cabinet memorandum and then look at the recommendations specifically. And then Cabinet then approves those recommendations. So that constitutes a Cabinet decision. The minutes will then indicate that Cabinet has approved the following recommendations. So there would be no doubt on that matter. There would be, however, emergency matters that do not necessarily go through Cabinet committee subcommittees. So those matters will be taken directly to a Cabinet meeting. Obviously, the President has to give approval for those matters to come directly to Cabinet and not via Cabinet subcommittees. But the decisions will then follow the same format. There will have to be a proper Cabinet memorandum that states the recommendations, and then Cabinet approves those recommendations. And the Cabinet minutes will then indicate that the following decisions, which are recommendations, have been approved by Cabinet.
Thank you. And then just back to your experience of Cabinet meetings. What is the source of that experience and how long did it last for?
Well, my experience you assume the role of CEO GCIS and automatically you become Cabinet spokesperson, and then you sit in those Cabinet meetings. But because you need to be informed in great detail about the contents of Cabinet decisions, I made it my duty to also attend as many of the Cabinet subcommittee meetings as possible. Because in many of those policy issues, Cabinet doesn't have time to go through detailed discussions on each and every issue. So the debates actually take place in the Cabinet subcommittee meetings. So I sat in those Cabinet subcommittee meetings so that by the time a decision is taken at Cabinet, and I'm expected to announce and tell the public what Cabinet has decided, I would have had insight into the real reason why such a decision would have been taken. So I received files of all meetings, Cabinet subcommittee meetings, in advance, and I would receive files of all Cabinet meetings in advance so that I get ready for those particular meetings. So that's how the process worked.
Mr. Maseko, in the last moments of your testimony, you said you'd received all files of Cabinet meetings. I suspect you might have meant to say memoranda. Is that right?
Well, by files, I mean, yes, all the Cabinet memoranda that would have been submitted to Cabinet.
And would you receive those memoranda?
Sorry, Ms. Hoffman. Try as far as possible, Mr. Maseko, to face this side as you answer the questions.
Apologies.
I know that the tendency is to look at the person who is asking you questions.
My apologies.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Maseko, would you, as spokesperson for Cabinet in your role as DG of GCIS, be provided with the Cabinet memoranda prior to a Cabinet meeting?
As Cabinet spokesperson, Chairperson, I received the files the same time as all ministers receive. So all the Cabinet memoranda that will be appearing at the Cabinet meeting, I'll receive them. And usually if the Cabinet meeting is on a Wednesday, the files are distributed by Monday afternoon so that we all have a full day to engage with all the matters. So short answer to your question, that's correct. I do receive the files in advance.
Thank you. Chair, I'll move in a moment to the evidence that the Commission has managed to obtain in relation to the particular meeting on the 2nd of February 2011, when the transfers of Mr. Maseko and Mr. Manyi were discussed. But in advance of doing that, and just to get the benefit of Mr. Maseko's experience on this matter, I beg leave to hand up a pre-declassified Cabinet minute that has come before the Commission in other evidence. It was in fact the evidence of Minister Gordhan,
Yes.
It comes from his supplementary bundle, which was Exhibit M2. We haven't included it in these bundles because it actually lives elsewhere in the records of the Commission.
Yes.
But it is an example of a declassified cabinet minute that I'd like to ask Mr. Maseko's assistance on, because his testimony until this point has indicated to us a particular procedure for what is then noted in the minutes. And I'd like to ask him to comment on this particular minute with that background. So if I may hand that up.
That's fine.
We'll also make one available to the witness.
Thank you. I got it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. So just for the record purposes, this is an extract of pages 59 and 60 of Exhibit M for Mother 2, which was Minister Gordhan's supplementary bundle. And it is, as I understand from his evidence, a declassified cabinet minute of the meeting of the 31st of August 2016. Mr. Maseko, is this type of document familiar to you?
This is the format, yes, that was used when I was there.
Do you recall having seen this particular minute?
Not this particular one, Chair, no?
Well, if I may just take you to, first of all, paragraph 5.1.2, because in your evidence a moment ago you indicated that on certain occasions Cabinet notes various things. What is recorded at paragraph 5.1.2?
Well, the minute says Cabinet noted that the Minister of Finance will be providing a detailed briefing on the above matter in due course.
And again at 5.2.2?
In 5.2.2, it says Cabinet noted the briefing by the Minister of Finance.
And how is that different from what's recorded at 5.3 on that page?
Well, what the minutes, Cabinet minutes normally do is they don't include the total substance of a Cabinet memorandum, because of space and all of those kinds of things. So noting means that certain matters were brought to the attention of Cabinet. So that's why it simply notes that the Cabinet is aware of the briefing that would have been contained in the Cabinet memorandum. And the difference between noting and approved, which is covered under 5.3, is that it then says this, the previous things were noted, but on these particular matters, Cabinet decided, and the term used is either approved or resolved. But that's why it says these matters were decided upon.
Thank you. So if you could read into the record what Cabinet approved under 5.3 as it's recorded there.
Well, this minute says Cabinet approved the appointment of a permanent board comprising of the following people. This is appointment of the board of the South African Airways. Do I need to read the names?
No, that's not necessary. Just the essence of the
yeah, so we
decision.
Can also move on. It approved that a person by the name of Ms. Dimieni be reappointed as chairperson of the board for the following period. It then approved that a certain Ms. Ramana be appointed as deputy chairperson. And then it says noted that the new board would be tasked to work on measures to be implemented with a view to placing SAA in a stronger position in terms of governance and improving the likelihood of possible financial recovery, and approve that Cabinet be briefed in due course.
Thank you. And if you'll return to paginated page 59. That's the first page of the document handed up to you. Can you please tell us about what appears as a heading at paragraph 5.3, and then what is indicated below that heading?
Okay, are we back to...
We're back to the document you were working on, just the first page of it. Sorry, the one that was handed up.
Oh, yeah,
cabinet
the very
memo.
Okay. Page 50.
Indeed. I've taken you back a page.
Okay.
What I'm interested in now is your assistance with the heading that appears at paragraph 5.3, and then your assistance in understanding what is reflected in brackets after that heading, immediately below it.
Okay, the heading says appointment and reappointment of directors to the board of SAA.
And then the small text beneath that in brackets?
Right at the bottom.
No, just under the heading.
Oh, it says Cabinet Memorandum number 5 of 2016, dated 24th August 2016, file number M2135, Minister of Finance, refer to item of minutes dated 22nd October 2014.
And assist us with what that means, please.
This basically is an attempt to make sure that there's proper cross-referencing. So if a decision is taken today, whoever is reading these minutes must know that there's relevant information that is contained in a different minutes of a different meeting.
So would it be correct to say that the fine print under the heading is simply to tell the reader where to find more information about this issue?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
And is the reference to cabinet memorandum there, is that related to your earlier testimony, the memorandum that would have preceded the decision that was being sought from cabinet?
I think so, Chair. That would be the relevant. And if I'm looking at the dates, 24th August, and this minute is referring to 31st August. So what that would mean is that the cabinet memoranda was tabled at a cabinet subcommittee, which took place on the 24th. And the matter is now coming to cabinet for a decision on the 31st of August, 2016.
And then that reference to the previous minutes, as I understand it, is so that the reader can locate a relevant other minutes of meeting that related to this topic. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair. So my reading of this is that the matter would have served at a cabinet meeting, again at a cabinet meeting, August, October, yeah. Yeah, so it would refer to another discussion that took place at the meeting of the 22nd of October 2014.
Thank you.
The date of 31, I see we have 3 mics, Ms. Mayor. The date of 31 August 2016, which appears at the top, would that represent the date of the meeting to which these minutes relate?
Okay, yes, Chair. I'm seeing this for the first time, but I think that's how,
Yes.
remembering the format then.
Yes, the format,
I think the date at the top would be date of a cabinet meeting.
Yes.
The 24th would have referred to the date of a cabinet subcommittee meeting where this matter served before it appeared on the agenda of the meeting of the 31st.
Yes.
In that paragraph with the small letters referring to a meeting of the 22nd October 2014, that means that the matter would have served at a cabinet meeting almost 2 years prior to this particular meeting, and that meeting would have taken decisions and given instructions to Minister of Finance to do what is contained in this memorandum.
Yes, no, thank you.
And then one final follow-up in relation to that small text. It appears that the memorandum is given a number. Is that something you can assist us with?
That's correct, Chairperson. Every cabinet memo is given a number and a date, and so that there's proper referencing in future.
Mr. Maseko, if we can ask you to cast your mind back to the meeting of the 2nd of February 2011, at which the announcement was made of your transfer. Were you provided with a cabinet memorandum in relation to your transfer or the transfer of Mr. Manyi in advance of that meeting?
No, sir, and I never saw any of those cabinet memo.
Chair, the Commission has undertaken various investigations in the light of Mr. Maseko and Mr. Zuma's evidence about the decision to transfer Mr. Maseko and Mr. Manyi. It culminated in confirmation last evening from the Office of the Presidency that the Cabinet minutes for the 2nd of February 2011 have been considered, and there is no reference anywhere in those minutes to the transfers of Mr. Maseko or Mr. Manyi. Chair, it's in a slightly different category to the documents we're waiting for from the DPSA, because if I can just give a little bit of background to the process. As you would have seen, and Mr. Maseko, you can see on the page that I've handed up, in order for cabinet minutes to be provided to the Commission, they must be declassified. You will see that there is a stamp on page 59 in front of us, which bears a stamp indicating declassified. So there's a process that the Commission engages in order to have cabinet minutes declassified, and part of that process is to identify the particular aspect of the minute in respect of which declassification is sought. So those were the extent of the engagements with the Office of the Presidency, and as recently as last night, the upshot of their inquiries into this matter is that there's no document to declassify because the minutes of the 2nd of February 2011 do not contain any item recording a decision of Cabinet about the transfers of Mr. Maseko and Mr. Manyi. Now, it happened as recently as last night. The Office of the Presidency was informed last night that I would make this indication today publicly in the hearing, and they have been requested to provide an affidavit to the Commission confirming these facts. But given their relevance to the evidence of Mr. Maseko, we indicated to the Office that we would disclose today what their investigations had revealed about those minutes. And so I do so for the purposes of the record and also to be able now to ask Mr. Maseko certain further questions about that meeting.
So what you have been told by the Presidency is that they have looked at the minutes or documents which would contain any cabinet decision, if there was any, relating to Mr. Maseko's transfer from GCIS to DPSA on or about the 3rd of February 2011.
Yes,
and,
Chair, the 2nd of February was the date of the meeting. Yes.
And they have found nothing reflecting such a decision.
Indeed.
Yes, okay.
Indeed. And just to be absolutely clear, it was a request that they source the minutes of the document akin to the document we're looking at for the Cabinet meeting on the 2nd of February, and to declassify any aspect of those minutes which disclosed a decision of Cabinet, and indeed we went broader, any reference at all to the transfers of Mr. Maseko and Mr. Manyi. And the information we have been given is that that does not appear on the minutes of the 2nd of February 2011, and there will be an affidavit provided to the Commission to that effect, hopefully in the course of today.
Okay.
So if I may just come back then, Mr. Maseko, to Mr. Zuma's evidence. Because Mr. Zuma's evidence was that Cabinet takes the decision to transfer DGs, and in particular in relation to you, his evidence was, we take the decision. Chair, it may just be pertinent. I referenced it earlier. It is at page 28 of the transcript of Mr. Zuma's evidence on the 16th of July. And it is there that Mr. Zuma on the transcript is reflected to have said, in the context of a series of discussions from my learned friend, Mr. Pretoria, about this very transfer of Mr. Maseko from GCIS to a DPSA. And Mr. Zuma, about line 8 on that page, says, and then the cabinet will, we take the decision. Mr. Maseko?
Yes.
In relation to the 2nd of February 2011 cabinet meeting, were you in attendance for that meeting?
Yes, Chairperson, I was present at the meeting.
Do you recall cabinet taking any decision in relation to your transfer or Mr. Manyi's transfer on that day?
Chairperson, what transpired on that day is that an announcement was made at the cabinet meeting by Minister Chabane. There was no discussion or decision, and it was done right at the end of the meeting as one of the announcements. That is when President Zuma informed Cabinet and requested Minister Chabane to make an announcement. But I was at the meeting, there was no discussion. It was simply an announcement.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to go back to a question that I think Ms. Hofmeyer asked you, but I want to make sure I understand. You said that you would receive the memoranda or documentation that ministers would receive ahead of a particular cabinet meeting, being documents that they must consider in preparation for the meeting.
That's correct.
And in regard to the meeting of the 2nd of February 2011, did you receive any documents at all ahead of that cabinet meeting that related to issues that would be discussed at that meeting?
That's correct, sir.
Was there any document among the documents that you received ahead of that meeting that related to your transfer or Mr. Manyi's transfer?
There was no such a document.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Maseko, if we can then go to the next aspect of Mr. Zuma's evidence, on which I'd like your comment. Mr. Zuma said in the transcript of the 16th of July 2019, and for the record, the references are at pages 26, 50, 51, and 52. He said that there was shifting around of Director Generals at the time of the meeting of the 2nd of February 2011. Can you assist us on that at all? Are you aware of Director Generals generally have been shifted around at that period in time?
There may have been cases of Director Generals being moved around, but I'm not aware of a general situation where people are moved from one department to another. But as I say, I can't give a definitive answer to say there were no movements around at the time, but yeah.
On the 2nd of February, is it correct that there were at least 2 moves of Director Generals?
I subsequently became aware that there were 2 moves of Director Generals, yes.
And that was who?
That was myself and Mr. Manyi.
Thank you. Mr. Maseko, are you aware of the evidence that has been presented to the Commission since the evidence of Mr. Zuma, of Mr. Simons and Mr. Hlongwane?
Chairperson, I'm aware that there were subsequent submissions by those 2 gentlemen.
Thank you. That related to the question of whether Mr. Zuma had according to your original evidence, contacted Minister Shabani when he was abroad. Can you take us through what the source of your information is in relation to the contact between Mr. Zuma and Minister Shabani?
Well, my information came directly from Minister Shabani, who was my supervisor at the time, and that is via a call that I mentioned in my affidavit when he requested a meeting, an urgent meeting. It was on the Sunday. He said we need to meet urgently on the Monday morning. He did not divulge the purpose of the meeting, but we agreed to meet, and we did meet the following Monday, 8 o'clock was the time. And in that meeting, that's when he told me that he had received a call from President Zuma, who told him that I needed to be moved from GCIS. He was quite specific. He says he had received a call from the president, and the message from the call was that by the time the president comes back into the country, I should not be the CEO of GCIS. So that's why the matter needed to be resolved as speedily as possible. So I can end that just to answer your question, how did I know?
Thank you for that.
I'm sorry. Did you remember whether that is Mr. Shabane said to you that when the former president called to talk to him about this issue, he was furious? I seem to have picked that up from somewhere, but I want to clear that. Is that something that...
Chairperson, can I ask you a question? Who was furious, Minister Shabani or the president? Or the former president?
Mm.
I got a sense from Minister Shabani that the president had not given him an option. He needed to implement the decision to move me from GCIS.
Yes.
The only emotion I could relate to was on Mr. Shabani's part, that he seemed to be disappointed by the instruction that he had received, but nonetheless he had to implement it.
Yes. So it wouldn't have. I wouldn't have seen it in your evidence if I saw anything along those lines.
No, Chairperson, it would not be. No.
So the only emotion, as you say, was that you could tell that Mr. Shabane was disappointed about that turn of events.
That's correct, Chairperson.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Just as you've been engaging with Mr. Maseko, I have cast my eye over Mr. Maseko's previous affidavits. I don't see an indication there.
Yes.
Just so that we know.
I must just check where
it comes from.
I may have misunderstood some evidence.
Indeed.
But it's important that it be cleared.
Thank you. Mr. Maseko, if we can then deal just a little bit more with dates. Because over the course of the next 2 days, it's going to become clear how important accuracy about dates around this time is. I understand your testimony a moment or so ago to be that you received a call from Minister Shabani to schedule a meeting, and I understand your evidence to be you met the next day at 8 a.m. on the Monday. Is that correct?
That's correct.
When then did you receive the call?
I received the call from Minister Shabani the Sunday afternoon prior to the Monday.
Thank you. And just so that we can have the dates right, the Sunday that preceded the cabinet meeting on the 2nd of February was Sunday the 30th of January. Is that the date you're saying on which you were called?
That's correct, Chairperson.
Then you met on Monday, that would be the 31st of January, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the cabinet meeting that we've been discussing was the Wednesday, the 2nd of February, is that correct?
That's correct, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Did you get an understanding from Mr. Shabane as to when he had received the call from the former president, whether it had received it same day or the day before, or is that something that you did not gather?
Chair, I try to remember the conversation. We did not seem to have discussed when exactly he received the call from President Zuma, but
yes.
When we were having the discussion, it became clear that the call had been made recently. So it could have been the Saturday, the Friday, or the Sunday, but it was new information.
Yes.
And I'm saying that because I don't think the minister would have sat with such information if he had had the information for longer than a week.
Yes, I guess especially if the instruction was act urgently.
Yes.
On this matter.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, it's relevant at this point to again alert you to further investigations that have been done on related matters. And that is insofar as Mr. Zuma's travel around this period is concerned. But before I go there, Mr. Maseko, just remind us again, if you will, what was said by Minister Shabani about the whereabouts of Mr. Zuma as he relayed his conversation with Mr. Zuma to you?
He informed me that the former president was at a summit, an African Union Heads of State summit in Addis Ababa. And he was coming back, I think, the Monday, the 31st or the 1st. But he was on his way back from a summit.
And that cabinet meeting of the 2nd of February, had that been scheduled for some time?
That was a normal cabinet meeting scheduled, yes.
Thank you.
Meeting.
There would normally be a cabinet meeting every Wednesday, is that right?
No, the cabinet meetings are taking place fortnightly.
Oh, okay.
But there's a schedule of cabinet meetings for a full year.
But
so there's a calendar of all
And when
meetings.
they do take place, it's normally on a Wednesday?
It's normally on a Wednesday, yes, sir.
Okay, all right.
Chair, there is an affidavit that has been obtained from an official within the employ of the Department of Home Affairs about the travel of Mr. Zuma over this period. You will find it in Exhibit NN5, and it commences at page 158. Chair, this is an affidavit that we submit should be provisionally received as evidence in the Commission. We're not aware of anything contentious in it. Of course, that decision can be revisited in due course. But it's an affidavit that has been produced pursuant to the Commission seeking to establish the travel movements of Mr. Zuma and others who may have been traveling with him. Chair, I don't think it's necessary to go to the detail of the affidavit, except to indicate that there appears to have been an error in the departmental records. The error is as follows. It shows, the records show that Mr. Zuma arrived at Waterkloof Air Base on the 25th of January 2011, and then arrived again at the Waterkloof Air Base on the 1st of February 2011. That was further interrogated, and the upshot of Mr. Gelderblom's affidavit, which commences at page 58, is that that does appear to have been an error in the records, and what he confirms is that it appears that there was a flight out on the 25th of January 2011. It was a flight departing from South Africa headed to Switzerland. And then the next record in the Department of Home Affairs records is a return flight on the 1st of February 2011, which, as we have Mr. Maseko's evidence, is the day before the scheduled cabinet meeting. So that gives us some guidance as to time frames, at least insofar as Mr. Maseko's evidence is concerned, as well as the evidence of Mr. Simons and Mr. Hlongwane.
Now, that affidavit will be admitted, and obviously If anybody, including the former president, wishes to challenge it, they may do so. But I think it's highly unlikely that there would be a dispute about when he may have left South Africa and when he may have come back around that time.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Maseko, I'd then like to move to the next topic, which is your exit from DPSA, where you had been moved on the 2nd of February 2011. I'm going to pick up a series of details about that insofar as you've been asked for your comment in response to the affidavit that was received from former Minister Bello. So please know I'm going to come to all of that in due course. But what I would like to focus on at the moment is what you were paid when you left DPSA. Because it's a matter that comes up actually in your transcript with the public protector. You'll see that that transcript has been included in Exhibit NN1, which is the exhibit containing your...
Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Please don't forget what you were dealing with. Because you are moving to, I think, Mr. Masego's tenure at DPSA, I just want to finalize something in regard to GCIS and this transfer. I did already ask you previously, Mr. Maseko, about your performance and so on at GCIS. Transfers of Directors General. Do you know under what circumstances they normally happened in terms of prescripts legislation as the position was when you were CEO of GCIS?
Chairperson, a number of reasons could exist for the transfer, and this could either be differences between an accounting officer and a minister, so DG and a minister where they can't work together. Or secondly, a preference by the Director General or a request to be transferred to another department, or a request from another minister saying, I need these skills in this particular department, and can the person be transferred? Or because if it's questions of poor performance, that doesn't lead to a transfer. It should lead to a dismissal of a Director General. So in the majority of cases that I'm aware of in our government, transfers normally happen when there's a dispute between the DG and the minister, and government, there could be an agreement that, in fact, the minister says, I can't work with this person. The minister goes to the president, and then they reach agreement that, okay, you can't work with the person, but the skill is still required in government, so the person doesn't need to be fired. So they find alternative placement. And I think there are quite a number of examples where that actually has happened.
So your understanding is that if a minister is not happy with the performance of his or her Director General, that's not, or at least during your time, that was not treated as a ground for a transfer. There was a separate process in regard to that. That's right.
That's my correct. That's yes. Correct. That's my understanding.
And your experience was that transfers of Directors General from one department to another occurred when the minister concerned and his or her Director General could not work together according to at least one of them, or there was some dispute, and then arrangements were made for the transfer of the Director General from that department to another department.
That's correct, Chair. And in my reading, if I can just bear your indulgence here, in my reading of the topic, some research has been done on this. A lot of those kinds of transfers tended to happen when there's a change of government, in the sense that there's a reshuffle or there's been new elections. In most of the cases, we find a new minister coming into a department and finding that they don't want to work with this Director General, or they prefer another person to work in this in their particular department. So a lot of the transfers would be linked very closely to changes in the administration on the part of ministers, where ministers feel they want their own Directors General to be appointed.
Yes. Now, in the case of any allegations of misconduct, could that be a ground for the transfer of a Director General, as far as you know, in terms of practices at the time?
As if there is a case of misconduct, there would have to be a process where there's an investigation of the matter, which could lead to either a suspension of a Director General, but ordinarily it would not be a cause or a reason to transfer, because then that could be, the misconduct could be so serious that it's a reason to dismiss, not to transfer to another department.
Yes. You see, I ask these questions because, as you will appreciate, and Ms. Hofmeyer knows, we have to see exactly what the reason was for your transfer. You know, we're trying to establish that. So you say, in this case, between yourself and Minister Chabane, there was no dispute of any kind, and the working relationship was fine. Is that your evidence?
My evidence, Chairperson, is that without any shade of a doubt, there was no dispute between myself and Minister Chabane.
Yes.
And that's why when I asked him the question, why am I being moved from GCIS? He could not give a reason except to say that it's the President's decision, and his job as Minister is to implement the decision.
Yes.
So there is no written letter, no conversation between me and Mr. Chabane to indicate his unhappiness about my role in the department.
Yes. And of course, we now know, based on the letter that to which Ms. Hofmeyer referred you, that this would be the same minister who a few months before your transfer had scored you 114% in terms of your performance assessments.
That's correct, Chair.
So a few months before, he was extremely very happy with your performance.
That's correct, Chairperson.
So based on what you know and what your relationship was with him, could there be any basis why he may have wanted you to be transferred from his department to another department?
As far as I'm aware, Chairperson, Minister Chabane had no basis, had no reason.
Yes.
Or there was no incident that could have prompted him to decide that I should move. And that is why he then, I think it's in my original affidavit, where he made the point that instead of throwing me into the streets, he'd rather find an alternative post for me in government, because he knew that I had not done anything wrong. So it's an indication to me that there was no issue at all between the two of us.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. I note that we are at the usual time for the scheduled break, and I was moving to another topic. So if it's convenient to take the tea adjournment now.
Yes, let's take the tea adjournment now. It's about 19 minutes past, 20 past. We will resume at 25 to 12. We adjourn.
All rise.
Can you just refresh our memories about when you moved to the department? When was that?
That was in February of 2011.
And for how long did you remain in the department?
I think it's 5 months.
So when did you exit?
July 2011.
Thank you. I referred before the break to a transcript of a meeting that was held between yourself and the public protector, and I indicated that that had been included in your bundle. I'd like to pick up that transcript at page 53, 53. That's of the paginated pages that appear in the top right-hand corner, and that's of Exhibit NN1.
Okay.
And perhaps, in fact, if we can go back one page to page 52, because, Chair, over the break, Mr. Maseko's legal representative drew my attention to something that may well have been what you were thinking about earlier when you made reference to somebody being extremely angry.
Furious.
Furious, indeed. Well, it may be that it was the reference in this transcript to what Mr. Maseko had said at page 52. Mr. Maseko, can you confirm what this document is that we're looking at?
So we're talking about NN1 52, page 52.
Indeed. And it commences, if you'd like to just go there, at page 33, 33 of Exhibit NN1.
Chairperson, that is the transcript of the interview I had with the public protector on the 17th of August 2016.
And then if you go to page 52.
I got it.
There's a question there about 4 lines down that reads, okay, and then you became DG of Public, and then the transcript reflects you add of Public Service and Administration. You're asked for how long, and then if you can read into the record what you are reflected as having said then.
In the record, it says for 3 months.
Based on your evidence, is that accurate?
That's not accurate, Chairperson. I think I meant 5 months. It should be.
Thank you. And then what do you go on to say?
I go on to say now there it was impossible to stay because Minister Malloy was extremely angry that I was imposed on him and that nobody spoke to him, nobody consulted him. We had to include it in the statement, in the cabinet statement, that is, that I issued that day, to say I'm no longer CEO of GCIS, I'm now DG of GPSA. So he heard it from me for the first time.
Oh, so that might well be.
That might have been,
yeah, that
indeed.
might have been where. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Chair, we may, and Mr. Maseko, we'll go to your interactions with Mr. Bello in a moment, but the point I'm focusing on now, you'll find over the page at page 53. That's where you engage, as I read this transcript, in a discussion about what you were paid when you left DPSA. Can you please tell us first of all, what's reflected in the transcript about what you said?
The transcript reflects that I was paid, it came to 1.7 million rands before tax.
Is that at line 13?
That's headline 13, yeah, that's correct.
And is that correct, that you were paid 1.7 million?
That's not correct, Chairperson. The correct amount is what is reflected in what was actually paid by DPSA records.
And why do you think you made that error?
Chairperson, it was a bit of context. I got a call from the Public Protector's Office to say they had seen what I'd said in the media about the Gupta family, and they wanted to talk to me about it. I asked for more details, and I asked them if I needed to bring a lawyer. They said, no, you don't need a lawyer, just come. We want to just come and interview you. So it was a very stressful period. So when they asked me a question about how much was the package, I mentioned the 1.7 million rands. That is the amount that, when I was removed from GCIS, I consulted with a labor consultant who informed me and agreed with me that, in fact, the way I was removed from GCIS amounted to gross unfair labor practice, and that I could sue the state for unfair dismissal and also include damages because of the way the matter had actually unfolded. And we're in agreement that my claim would be somewhere around this amount of 1.7 million rands. So when the question came during the interview with the public protector, that's the figure that came to mind. But the amount we eventually settled for was somewhere around 1.1 million rands when I exited in July. But I just want to draw the Commission's attention to the fact that that amount was referring to the period if I had left the public service in February. This is the amount that we could have claimed. But for the record, yes, I submit that, in fact, the correct amount is what is reflected in the DPSA numbers.
If we can then take you to your affidavit in response to questions from the Commission about this aspect. And you'll find that in NN1 at page 2.
Okay.
I'd like to pick it up at paragraph 1.3, because there you talk about a meeting between, that was held on the 15th of June 2011. Who was that meeting between?
That was a meeting I had with Minister Malloy, who was Minister of DPSA at the time.
And what was the subject matter of the meeting?
The purpose of the meeting was basically to discuss my exit, my departure from DPSA. The subject of the meeting was that, look, I had come to the conclusion that things were not working out at DPSA, and the minister and I were in agreement that, in fact, the situation was less than desirable, and we're starting to discuss options to exit the public service.
Mr. Maseko, when the Commission received this affidavit, it engaged in correspondence with you because it appeared that some of the annexures to the affidavit had been incorrectly named. Yes. Can you confirm that that's correct?
That is correct, Chairperson.
I'd then like you to move to page 8.1 of Exhibit NN1.
What page again?
8.1, Chair.
Oh,
it's the first page after the affidavit actually concludes.
Okay, thank you.
What is that document?
This, okay, 8.1.
Yes.
That is the letter I wrote to Minister Barlow, basically confirming the proposal or the agreement with reached that my contract should be redetermined.
Can you just explain to us what redetermination of a contract means?
It's a, should I say, a technical term used in government. If a DG departs from their position ahead of the end of their contract, it's a term we use to refer to early termination of a contract, yes. So at the meeting of the 15th, we had agreed that, in fact, I would be leaving the public service.
So it's basically a fresh determination of the period of the contract.
Well, it amounts to that, yes.
It amounts to that. Yeah. Initially, when the contract was concluded, the period may have been 3 years or 5 years.
Yeah.
When you talk about redetermining the contract, you are actually looking at saying, let's change the period of that contract.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That's correct.
And if you then go over 2 pages to page 9, Can you please identify what that document is?
This is a document which was prepared by the Department of Public Service and Administration. It's a document addressed to me, which basically outlines the terms under which I would be exiting the public service. Its heading says redetermination of term of office of Director General, and it is directed to me. So it outlines the process, the details of the settlement, termination date. It was signed by the minister, and I co-signed it to basically confirm that I'm accepting this agreement to exit the public service.
And can you please help us with paragraph 2? Because paragraph 2 seems to talk about a calculation. What is that?
Well, this paragraph basically is an extraction from the Public Service Act, which talks about special service benefits that will be payable to me. That is a lump sum amount. And this is, and then it says how it will be calculated. It says for the first 3 months, it will be 100% of your gross monthly remuneration. And then the remainder, which is 9 months, or part thereof, it will be 80% of your gross monthly income. So this is extracted from the Public Service Act.
Thank you. And is that a standard calculation that's applied?
That is a standard calculation when matters of redetermination are being considered.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier in your testimony that your reference to 1.7 million was in error.
Yep.
It was not the amount you were in fact paid. So I understand your testimony, that was a reference to a figure you had in your mind because of discussions you'd had at the time of your move from GCIS and the possible claim you may have against the department. Is that correct, Mr.
That's
Maseko?
correct. That's correct, Chairperson.
Your testimony was also that the final amount that was paid would be evidenced in the records of the department, and so the Commission has taken steps to seek to acquire those. I'd like you to turn to page 27 of NN1.
Okay, I'm there, Chairperson.
Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I saw it.
And what does this document reflect?
This document basically is a document originating from the Personnel Administration section of DPSA. It then outlines how the payment will be made. It mentions my period of employment, and then it says the settlement will be as follows. For 3 months, I'll be paid 100% of my gross remuneration, which amounted to 390,974 rands. And for the 8 months, it will be 80% of my gross monthly remuneration, which amounted to 834.78 rands. And translated as follows: all-inclusive salary package per annum was 1.4, 10% non-pensionable allowance for heads of departments, 142,172. It then gives an instruction, presumably this was to HR, please pay the lump sum minus the 9 days of overpayment before 31st of August 2011. And the amount was 1.1 million rands.
That is a gross amount, is it?
That is the gross amount before tax.
And then if you go over the page, have you seen that document before?
Yes, I've seen it, Chairperson. So having received the instruction from HR, the salary division then produces a payment slip, and it shows the following figures. pay date, I don't need to go through all the details, but essentially it says the net amount paid was 710,163. This was also after deductions, and it details what those deductions were.
And Mr. Maseko, we understand your evidence. That's a calculation based on a redetermination for the remaining period of your contract. When was your existing contract due to expire?
Okay. I've looked at too many numbers now. It was meant to expire in 2012.
Yes, I don't think it's contentious. As I have the date, it's the 30th of June 2012. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yeah.
And so this calculation that was done, was there anything unusual about it insofar as the amount that was paid to you?
Nothing unusual. The amount determined by the department, and they had not say, presumably, over what the taxman decides to deduct. I still think the taxman over-deducted, but I think what it shows is that in total, the consolidated, after all the deductions, it came to 853,034 rands.
Thank you.
But those figures are not in dispute. They're correct.
Thank you.
When you say that the payment of that amount was unusual, as I understand your evidence, do you mean that it was normal within the public service that when the contract of a Director General was being redetermined and he or she had to leave, she would be paid in accordance with a certain formula, and the payment would be taking into account, among other things, maybe, that there was a period of her contract that she would ordinarily have been expected to work, which she didn't work and had to leave?
The formula is prescribed by the Public Service Act and regulations. So I would say the Minister of Public Service and Administration doesn't have much discretion, especially in cases where there's an admission that, in fact, the procedures that were used to move you from one place to another were not proper, were not complied with. The fact that when I moved from GCIS to DPSA, there was no formal contract that confirmed that I was now actually a DG at Public Service and Administration. So, in fact, as far as I was aware, the only document that was proof that I was DG of DPSA was the press statement that I issued. But there was no formal contract that I signed with the Minister of Public Service and Administration.
I guess there would probably also have been a presidential minute, or you are not sure about that?
I was not aware of a presidential minute until I read the affidavit by Minister Malloy, but at the time I was not aware of such.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you were a DG with really no proof of being DG of the department.
Chair, that's why I think somewhere in one of the affidavits, I do, in fact, it was in the public protector's documents, where I even used strong language to say even this payment was illegal because my move was not regularized. But when I look at the affidavit of Minister Barlow, or Mr. Barlow, it does appear that there was some regularization of the process somewhere, which was not brought to my attention.
But effectively, at DPSA, if you said you were DG and somebody says prove it, you wouldn't know what to do, what to put up except the media statement.
I would have to produce my media statement, Chair.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. Mr. Maseko, I'd then like to move to your responses to Mr. Belloy's affidavit, if we may. Now, you provided an affidavit to the Commission with your responses, and that you'll find in Exhibit NN1 from page 13.
I got it.
What I propose to do, Mr. Maseko, is, again, as I did with Mr. Zuma's evidence, to take you to the nub of what appears to be the contention between Mr. Bello and yourself, insofar as your further evidence was concerned, and then to ask you to assist us with your response. Mr. Belloy's evidence, which is an affidavit which has been provided to you and in respect of which he will be giving oral evidence at the Commission in due course, says that before you were transferred out of GCIS and to DPSA, he discussed that transfer with you and he obtained your consent. What is your response to that?
Chairperson, may I beg for your indulgence for 2 seconds just to go to point 4 on page 14 of my affidavit?
Yes. Okay.
To just clarify one important point, and that is that at no stage in my affidavits to the Commission, nor in my oral submission to yourself, did I ever suggest that Mr. Malloy was involved in any instances of state capture or corruption. Because my reading of his affidavit is suggesting, or he got an impression that in fact I made such an accusation. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. But in response to your...
Well, before that, when I read that part of your affidavit, I didn't understand where it came from, because I thought I didn't see anything that may have given any impression that the Commission was saying that's what you said about him. So, but you are saying you got the impression from his affidavit.
From his affidavit.
That he seems to have thought that's what you said.
Yes, that's correct.
And you wanted to clarify that you never said that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. To respond, apologies for that diversion. To respond to your question, my answer is an emphatic no. That's what Mr. Barlow says is not correct. Again, it's important for me to recount how the process unfolded. We're sitting in a cabinet meeting. There's a news report that I've been fired. I check with my minister. The minister checks with the president. The president confirms the move. Then the minister then is asked to make an announcement that I'm leaving GCIS and I'm moving to DPSA. Unfortunately, Minister Malloy is not at the cabinet meeting, and I'm required to prepare a cabinet statement immediately after that meeting. So I call Mr. Malloy to say, this is what has transpired, and unfortunately, I'm your new DG. And in that conversation, he was surprised. So at no stage did I have a conversation with Minister Malloy about my move from GCIS to DPSA until after the cabinet meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Maseko. If I can just remind you to direct your answers to the chair, if I may.
My apologies.
But if I can just probe that a little bit further, I mentioned earlier that dates and timing are quite important. As I understand your evidence, you were first contacted by Minister Shabani about the need to meet on Sunday the 30th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was where he was relaying to you as your evidence has it, the instruction from President Zuma that you must be removed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Had you had any indication from Minister Shabani prior to that date that you would be removed?
Not prior to our meeting. When I had the meeting with Minister Shabani on the 31st of January, he informed me about the call he had received from President Zuma. Then how we concluded that meeting, Minister Shabani and I, was that he was going to explore options for me to be appointed or transferred to as a DG, because he was convinced that, in fact, I had not done anything wrong. In fact, his words which I included in the transcript, in the public protector and in my affidavit. He said he's not going to throw me into the streets because he knew that I had not done anything wrong. So he was going to find an alternative place. So between the 31st and the 2nd, I had hoped that he was thinking about where to transfer me to, and I had in principle, considered that he was going to come back to me. So that's why when the news broke on Wednesday, it was a bit of a shock to both of us.
Now, Mr. Belloy's affidavit indicates that he met with you, which I understand you to say did not take place, and furthermore to say that in that interaction you gave your consent to the transfer. What is your evidence on that?
My evidence, Chairperson, without any doubt, is that there was no such a discussion. When, at the end of that cabinet meeting, when the announcement was made, when I called Minister Chaban, or Minister Malloy or Mr. Malloy to inform him that, in fact, this is the outcome, I'll be announcing that I was his new DG, he did express surprise and shock because he says, but nobody had consulted him, nobody had informed him about this. But I said he should speak to Minister Chabane because unfortunately I have to make the announcement, and it would not be. Well, Minister Chabane did not want an announcement that says, I've left GCIS, but he didn't know where I was going. So because it would have meant that announcement in cabinet would have amounted to a dismissal. So he did not want that to happen. So the announcement was made, there was no time. The fact of the matter is that the reason why Mr. Barlow was not at the cabinet meeting was because he had other commitments. He may have been out of town, I don't know. So there was no opportunity to have a meeting with Mr. Barlow before the cabinet statement was issued. So we're talking about a matter of hours here.
So you say, one, he was surprised that you were telling him that you were his new DG.
Yes, he was.
And he said nobody had consulted him about the issue of your transfer.
He said he was not consulted.
Now, that is quite important, and I just want you to be sure that your recollection is quite clear, because in his evidence, in his affidavit, and I'm sure Ms. Hofmeyer was going to deal with it, in his affidavit, he says he had discussions with Minister Chabane before you were transferred. Are you quite clear that he said nobody had consulted him?
Chair, in my affidavit, I do say that I can't confirm whether Mr. Malloy had a conversation with Mr. Chabane, because I was not privy to that, I was not aware.
Yes.
All I am aware of is that when Minister Chabane made the announcement at the cabinet meeting that I was going to be transferred to DPSA, the time was so tight that he had not even had the chance to come back to me and say, actually, I'm moving you to DPSA. That's how tight the time frames were. So it's possible that they might have had discussions, as two ministers. It's possible that maybe Minister Malloy expected further discussions, but if we had discussed the matter, if we had consulted, if I had agreed to it as DG, there would not be a need why a cabinet memo was not produced, so that the matter is formalized in the cabinet meeting. So the reason why there was no cabinet memo is because Mr. Chabane was trying to manage a very complex situation, which was announcing that somebody is moving from this post but not knowing where to take them to. So DPSA became the option that he thought would work the best. So whether they had discussions prior to that cabinet meeting, I cannot confirm.
So you don't know whether Mr. Bello had a discussion with Mr. Chabane about your transfer, but what you do know is that he seemed surprised when you told him you were his new DG, And you say he did say to you nobody had consulted him.
Yes,
Yes.
I'm absolutely certain about that, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. If we can then go back to what I understand your evidence to be about the first time you were alerted to the need to remove you from GCIS. Just to be clear, that was in the meeting on the morning of Monday, the 31st of January. Is that right?
That's correct.
The cabinet meeting is Wednesday of that week, the 2nd of February, correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell us about your movements over those days? Because I'm trying to establish whether there was space for meetings or otherwise with Mr. Bello in that period.
Chairperson tried to retrieve my diary from GCIS, but it was no longer available because of the passage of time. But I can assure you that the period between a Monday and a Wednesday of a cabinet meeting, those are generally times that I would clear my diary because you receive arch-lever files of all these CAB memos, and I spent a lot of time going through all of those memos. So between a cabinet meeting, if it's in Pretoria, then I spend time in the office. But if a cabinet meeting happens to be in Cape Town, so Monday becomes a travel day, you go to Cape Town, you spend the whole of Tuesday preparing, reading all the documents. So a typical 2-day period before a cabinet meeting is essentially reading time, no meetings, just preparing for the cabinet meeting.
And again, just for clarification purposes, Mr. Maseko, is it your evidence that no meeting whatever took place between you and Mr. Bello prior to the 2nd of February 2011 on this topic?
Prior to the 2nd of February, I never had a meeting with Mr. Bello.
What's interesting is why he would say he did have, I don't know whether he said a meeting or just a discussion, which maybe was telephonic, I'm not sure, why he would say he had a discussion with you with regard to this issue of the transfer, if there wasn't such a discussion. Now, of course, you might not be able to say anything about that. All you might know is there was no such discussion. But I'm just sharing that with you as something that's going on in my mind. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Chair, the area of speculation is a very dangerous area, but my reading of Mr. Bello's affidavit, I think that is actually remembering a meeting when we're discussing options about me leaving the public service. So that meeting did happen.
Yes.
But it was not in relation to
your move from
my move from GCIS to DPSA. My move from GCIS to DPSA, I will say without any hesitation, wasn't planned, was abrupt, and it caught a lot of people by surprise, including the cabinet meeting itself. When the announcement was made, all the president did was, before the meeting ends, Mr. Chavan has an important announcement to make. He makes the announcement. And because I'd spoken to Mr. Chavan to say, listen, I'm doing the statement, I'm going to be announcing my departure. What do you want me to say? To say I'm leaving government? He says, no, I'll make a plan. I'll speak to somebody, to one of the ministers, to make sure that you get a placement. So when he made the announcement, yes, I was surprised, but surprised about which department I was going to. But I did know that he had made a commitment that by the time I prepare the statement, there will be a department that I'll be going to. And that was achieved. And the only unfortunate thing is that Mr. Malloy was not at the meeting.
Yes. So the only thing you can think of is that Mr. Barlow might be having in mind the meeting when you were about to leave DPSA and thinking that it's a meeting that took place before you came to DPSA.
That's my...
That's the only thing you can think of.
The best answer I can give to that.
Yes, okay.
Mr. Maseko, I'd like to move to that conversation in a moment. But before that, just to pick up on a point you've made a few times this morning, which is that Mr. Bello was not present at the Cabinet meeting on the 2nd of February 2011. Can I ask, related to that, your evidence has already been that you received no Cabinet memorandum in advance of that meeting relating to your transfer or Mr. Manyi's transfer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you just tell us about ordinary practice? If there were a Cabinet memorandum to serve before Cabinet at a meeting, would it usually be the case that the responsible minister would attend that meeting?
The expectation is that if a minister has a Cabinet memorandum serving before a Cabinet meeting, the minister attends. But if a minister is not able to attend, because most of the Cabinet memoranda go through Cabinet subcommittee, the chair of that subcommittee of that cluster would be mandated by the minister to say, please speak to this, I'm not able to attend. And normally the minister would also speak to the president to say, my item is on the agenda, I'm not available for the following reasons. Minister Y will actually present the memorandum on my behalf. So that would be practice.
Thank you. But on the 2nd of February 2011, did any of that take place in relation to your transfer?
In relation to my transfer, the only person who made the announcement was Minister Chabane.
Thank you.
And I think you have said that you only got to know to which department you were being transferred when Minister Chabane made the announcement to the Cabinet. Did I understand you correctly?
That's correct, yes.
Before that, you didn't know. All you knew was that he had made a commitment to you that he would try and place you somewhere.
Minister Chabane, after our conversation and his conversation with the President, was in and out of the Cabinet meeting. Yes. And I knew that, in fact, he was trying to find a minister that he could talk to so that an announcement could be made. So, yes, that's correct.
Yes. Yes, which ordinarily, I would imagine, may have given him an opportunity to speak to Mr. Malloy if he worked on the basis that he would need to speak to the relevant minister before anything is concluded.
That's correct.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Maseko, if we can then move to the meeting that you did have with Mr. Bello. I understand your effort at some speculation about why he said he had discussions with you before the transfer might be the product of confusing a later meeting you had with him. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's go to what Mr. Bello says about the conversation. Chair, you referred to discussion. I've just checked it again. Mr. Bello does say discussion. Oh, so it's a discussion that he alleges he had with you before the transfer. And he says that in that discussion, you communicated to him that you had decided not to stay long in the public service.
Okay.
What is your response to that?
I think I answered that question specifically in my affidavit.
You do indeed.
It is.
I can take you there. You pick it up at page 17 at paragraph 6.7.
That's correct, Chair. My submission as far as Mr. Barlow's affidavit is concerned, what it says in the affidavit, I do not think it is not accurate. The conversation I had with him about no longer wanting to stay in the public service and pursuing other interests, that was a conversation that took place in July of 2011, when we were basically discussing my exit from the public service and basically leaving DPSA. So it was not about leaving GCIS, moving to DPSA. So these are two different matters. Leaving GCIS had nothing to do with me no longer wanting to stay in the public service. It was about being forcefully moved from GCIS. So it would not even make sense to make such a statement. If I'm being shown the door at GCIS and I say I no longer want to stay in GCIS, I want to pursue other interests.
I'd like us to go, if we may, just to the precise words that Mr. Bello uses in his affidavit. You'll find it in the same file under tab 4.
Okay.
And you'll find it at page 12 of Mr. Bello's affidavit.
I got it.
And if we can pick it up at paragraph DD there. What Mr. Bello records there in his affidavit is the following. I recall that Mr. Maseko was very clear with me about his decision no longer to stay in public service, as he had other options to pursue, as he said so in response to my offer to extend his contract at the expiry of his term. And then if we move to paragraph EE. So, I knew his position about public service by the time the transfer was implemented, and I went ahead with the transfer, anticipating a possibility where he could change his mind, but also appreciating that he would have made a valuable contribution by the time he decided to leave. Mr. Maseko, confirm with me if you read that to indicate that this conversation with you, at which you made it clear you didn't want to stay long in the public service, was, according to Mr. Bello, prior to the transfer to his department.
These two paragraphs are incorrect insofar as they refer to my transfer from GCIS to DPSA.
Thank you.
So, is the position that he, as far as you are concerned, he is taking a conversation that happened on the occasion of your meeting with him just before you left DPSA and saying it's a conversation that took place before you were transferred from GCIS to DPSA?
That is exactly what I'm saying, Chair. And I don't think he's doing this deliberately. It's simply because these things happened a long time ago.
Yes.
It could simply be that he's remembering a conversation and thinking that it applies to one instance when in fact it applies to the other. But it is incorrect to suggest, for him to suggest that when I left GCIS, it was my plan not to stay in the public service. That discussion refers to my plan to leave DPSA.
Well, it may be that what he says in paragraph 1.1.6 of his affidavit at page 2 of the same affidavit, it may be that that's consistent with your analysis, because there he says that the information contained in my statement herein is largely, if not exclusively, based in my memory in circumstances where I no longer have access to such information that is located in the department wherein I served in various capacities as referred to in the background information in the statement. So with the lapse of time, it may well be, but he will come here at some stage and he will indicate. But the point you make is, to the extent that as far as you are concerned, he is saying what you said when you were about to leave DPSA is what you said when you were about to be transferred from GCIS, to the extent that that's what he is doing. You are saying you don't think he's doing so deliberately. You think he's just mistaken because of the lapse of time.
That's correct, Chairperson.
Okay.
Mr. Maseko, there is another, apologies, there is another important aspect of what he says in his affidavit, that discussion, that alleged discussion with you prior to your move to DPSA involved. Because the other important point is that he says he obtained your consent to move from GCIS to DPSA. Is that correct?
That is incorrect. Again, for the simple reason that the story leaked to the media, an announcement is made in Cabinet, which includes my transfer to DPSA. There was no, and my understanding or my agreement with the Minister Chabane at the time was that he'll make a plan for me. So there was no negotiation, no discussion. I was just happy that Minister Chabane was making a plan, and I went along with the plan.
Mr. Maseko, I know that you are not a lawyer, but do you have any understanding of the requirement of consent before a DG is transferred?
Chair, I can accuse myself of being a lawyer. I studied law, never practiced.
Actually,
Apologies, Mr.
I was
Maseko.
thinking I seem to remember you have got BA, LLB, and LLM or something like that. So you are a lawyer.
But consent is that you must do so consciously. It can be assumed that you're consenting, but anyway. The point I'm making is that Minister Chabane says, I'll make a plan for you, and I agree to the plan. I didn't know the details of the plan. Minister Chabane then makes an announcement in Cabinet. Minister Malloy is then informed of that, and we just have to implement the Cabinet announcement. But there was no I can say emphatically, Chair, there was no discussion about whether I consent or approve or agree. I just informed him that, in fact, this is what's going to happen. He's new DG. That's what I informed him, as stated in the transcript from the Public Protector.
Mr. Maseko, just, Chair, if we may just complete this point, because it may be useful just to go to the relevant legislative provisions so we have it in mind.
Yes.
Chair, you'll find it in the bundle before you entitled Legislation Bundle. Mr. Maseko, you'll also have a copy of it.
Yeah.
And if you turn to page 41 in that bundle, you'll find yourself in a section of the Public Service and Administration Act.
Got it.
Chair, this is the act that was in place at the time of the transfers of Mr. Maseko and Mr. Manyi. And if you pick it up at page 41 at section 12, the section that we're dealing with is section 12.3 on that page. You'll see there that the section reads, the President may transfer the head of a national department or national government component before or at the expiry of his or her term or extended term to perform functions in a similar or any other capacity in a national department or national government component in a post of equal, higher or lower grading or additional to the establishment as the President considers appropriate. And then if we go over the page, the point about consent, you'll find at section 3D, because 3D now puts certain requirements on that transfer. D says a transfer in terms of this subsection may only occur if A, the relevant head of department consents to the transfer, or after due consideration of any representations by the head, the transfer is in the public interest. Is that in accordance with your understanding of the position as it plays out in practice?
That's correct, Chairperson.
And I'd like to go through each of those two Roman numerals. I understand your evidence to be you did not give prior consent to this transfer. Is that correct?
Not specifically, no, to this. Not to the transfer to DPSA.
Thank you.
Before it was announced, let me say that.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't catch that last
I did not
part.
give consent to the transfer until it was announced, because I didn't know about it, but I had given consent to the principle of being moved to a different department.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then just in relation to Roman 2, did you make any representations about this transfer to President Zuma, former President Zuma, prior to the move to DPSA?
No, I did not.
Thank you.
Well, let's go back to the consent in principle that you gave. Well, you must just tell me if my understanding is correct. It seems to me that after the announcement to the cabinet of your transfer, or at least after the issuing of the media statement about your transfer from GCIS to DPSA, it could be said justifiably that your transfer from GCIS to DPSA was with your consent. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Yes. What becomes important is how did it come about that the transfer had to be considered and had to happen? And you have a version on that, how that came about. So from what you have said, it seems to me that you are saying you certainly did not initiate your transfer. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
You didn't ask for a transfer.
I did not ask for a transfer.
Yes. And as far as you are aware, Minister Chabane didn't ask or didn't initiate that you be transferred.
That's correct, Chair. That's correct. My understanding. Yeah.
According to Minister Chabane, it was the former president who came with the idea that you should be transferred, you should be moved from GCIS.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Maseko, I'd then like to explore with you when you did decide to leave DPSA. When was that?
I think, well, I think it was about 3 months into the job. That's when I decided maybe it's time for me to move on.
And why?
The reason stated in the affidavit was, in short, basically because I had found the situation in the department untenable. I think that although I state in the affidavit that I did not have a dispute with Mr. Malloy, but the relationship just did not gel, things did not work well. And I attribute that to the fact that he had felt I was imposed on him as a DG. So my arrival at DPSA, as far as I'm aware, was not formally announced. Many of the people I found at DPSA told me that they got to know about my arrival, that I was coming, or that I was there from the media, based on the media statement that I had issued. So the transition or transfer from GCIS to DPSA was not smooth. So when I arrived there, and I just felt, the minister was not as welcoming. I don't think that he had anything personal against me. And then I found that there were governance issues that I was concerned about. And by governance issues, I mean there were a lot of meetings which happened without my involvement. I was not invited to a lot of those meetings. There wasn't a formal meeting to formally introduce me to the management to say, hey, this is your new boss. So I just arrived, I had to fit into what was happening there. And I felt that a lot of the decisions that were being taken by the minister with my team in my absence had implications for me as the accounting officer. So if decisions are made to do certain things, And as accounting officer, I'm not informed or not part of those meetings. At the end of the day, I'm the one who's supposed to go to Parliament and account for those decisions. So I just felt the atmosphere was just not conducive to staying on. And I just felt I wasn't able to play the leadership role that I'm expected to as accounting officer. And that's when I decided I should move on.
And tell us about your interactions with Mr. Malloy about that move.
I then approached him and just did indicate to him that, and I think that's where his wording becomes relevant, where he said, I told him that I was now thinking of exiting to pursue other interests outside of the public service. And I must say it was a very cordial conversation. There wasn't a fight or argument about it. And I think that it took 2 meetings to agree that, in fact, this is the best way forward. And those meetings happened, I think the dates I gave, it's the
15th of June, as I recall it. Indeed.
10th and 15th of June.
Of July.
Or July.
Of June, I think.
I mean,
yeah, I think June.
Indeed.
It's written somewhere here.
2011.
And then he undertook to have a conversation with the president to get approval, because it can't just be a conversation between the two of us. He then undertook to speak to the president to get approval. He came back and said the president has agreed, and so they will do the paperwork. And the HR department will come back and discuss the detail, but that was how the matter was concluded. We even agreed that during that period while we were sorting these things, I didn't have to report to work. I can stay at home and wait for the payment to be made. So that's how it unfolded.
Thank you. Ms. Maseko, the chair mentioned a bit earlier a presidential minute relating to your transfer. Did I understand your testimony correctly to be that you had not seen that presidential minute?
Chair, I had not only not seen it, I was not aware that it existed. However, I think it's important to say that in my years in the public service, I've not seen too many of those minutes, because these are essentially presidential decisions.
Yes.
They're not they don't even serve in cabinet.
Mm.
So, yeah, but I had not seen I was not aware there was a cabinet minute.
Yeah.
I'd like you, just for the record, to take you to the presidential minute that the Commission has managed to obtain. You'll find it in Exhibit NN5, and you'll find it at page 50. Got
it. I got it, Chairperson.
Do I take it that you haven't seen this document before?
Chair, can I just read it?
Please read it first, indeed.
Chairperson, it is the first time that I see this document. I had not seen it.
Can you assist us with what it records?
Okay, the document is dated the 3rd of February 2011.
Mr. Maseko, sorry to interrupt you there. What is that date in relation to the cabinet meeting?
So this is, the 3rd would be the day after the cabinet meeting. The cabinet meeting was on the 2nd of February. So this, say, is dated the 3rd of February. So it will be after the
Thank you.
The cabinet meeting.
And what does it record?
It says, I hereby, in terms of, well, it says President's Minute number 32. I hereby, in terms of Section 12(3)(a), read with Section 12(3)(d) of the Public Service Act, promulgated under Proclamation number 103 of 1994, I hereby transfer Mr. T.J. Maseko from the post of DG of GCIS to the post of DG, Department of Public Service and Administration, with effect from the date following the date on which this presidential minute is signed by the President until 30th June 2012.
We referred to the 30th of June earlier.
Maybe he should complete and give the given under, because there is a significance to the date.
Okay.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Given under my hand and the seal of the Republic of South Africa at Pretoria on the 3rd day of February 2011, signed by, I think that is the President's signature, but it says President there. I can't recognize that.
Yes.
And then also signed by the Minister of Cabinet, presumably.
Do you know that signature?
It looks like, oh my God. This looks like Malloy's signature, but Mr.
Yes.
Barlow's signature, but I'm not sure.
Yes. You would have known Mr. Chabane's signature quite well, I would imagine.
Yes, I would have known.
It's not his.
I don't think this is his signature.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we'll be able to clarify with Mr. Bello, but I understand his evidence to be that he co-signed this minute insofar as his affidavit is concerned.
Yes, I think that's what his affidavit says.
Yes. Ms. Maseko, if I can then just take you back a page in that same file. Well, let's start at the beginning of the document at page 44.
Okay.
But before you do so, Ms. Hoffman,
Yes, Chair.
two things. This presidential minute, on the face of it, was signed on the 3rd of February 2011. That would be the day after the day that you were, on which you were transferred to the PSA, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
But it also says, if I understand it correctly, that the transfer would take place, your transfer would take place a day after the day on which it was signed. So which would mean the transfer would take effect on the 4th of February 2011. Is that your understanding of what it says as well?
Okay, let me just read it again, Chair.
Yeah.
With effect from the date. Oh, yes, that's what it means. It means from the 4th.
That's what it means.
Yeah.
But you did, as a matter of fact, move from GCIS to DPSA on the 2nd of February 2011.
Effectively, on the 2nd of February 2011, I was no longer the CEO of GCIS. So you could say that from the 2nd to the 3rd, I was in transit to DPSA. So I did not go back to my office after this cabinet meeting. So I had to prepare the statement and manage the media people, making sure there's proper distribution of statements, interviews, and all of that.
Yes,
but
no,
that was
understand.
essentially my last function.
Yes.
But I think that on the 3rd of February, you could say I was already the DG of DPSA.
Yes. No.
Well, on the 4th, according to this.
Yes. Now, I'm not talking about the legal position. I'm just talking practically.
Yeah.
My understanding of your evidence last time was that you actually moved to DPSA on the same day that you left GCIS. Did I misunderstand that? Practically.
Practically, Chair, I had to, after the cabinet meeting, had to sit and prepare the statement. So I was still doing GCIS duties.
GCIS work, yeah.
Yeah, statements.
Did you
blah, blah,
complete
blah.
the day? Because I understood your evidence to be that you didn't spend the whole day at GCIS on the day.
On the 2nd, yes.
On the 2nd, you left.
So I
My
continued
understanding
doing.
was that you left. Practically, you left and went to DPSA, but I may have misunderstood that part.
Yes, Chair. The correct position is that the cabinet meeting happens, announcement is made.
Yeah.
On the 2nd, so the afternoon, I stayed at the union buildings.
Yes,
And managed most of my operations
yes.
there. And If I remember well, the earliest, because I couldn't just rock up at DPSA.
Oh, okay.
So I had to
You may
try
have
and
gone
get
home.
hold of Minister
Yes.
Malloy
Yes.
to schedule a first meeting so that we can discuss.
okay.
And I think the meeting could have taken place on the 4th, but I know it was not immediate because he was out of town.
Okay. And in terms of your actual physical presence at DPSA, would that have happened from the 3rd or 4th, or you can't remember?
I can't recall exactly, Chair, but
Yes.
I was very clear in my head that I will only go to DPSA
Yes.
after I've had a meeting with the minister. Yes.
With Minister Barlow.
With Minister Bello.
Yes, okay, no, that's fine. Let's go back to the time you spent at DPSA. You said that most of the time, but maybe you said all the time, meetings were being held and decisions were being taken where you were not involved or invited to the meetings. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Must I say all the time, or
Well,
most of the time, or sometimes?
most of the time.
Most
Chair.
of the time. Okay, all right. Now, I take it that ordinarily when you are a DG, there would be, you would know what you need to do as Director General of your department. And therefore, to that extent, maybe you don't need to be told by your minister what to do. You know what to do, things that need to be done. But I would take it that there would be some things that you would say, please take care of that, or us do that. Please make sure that that is done, and so on. Am I right?
That's correct, Chair.
Yes. During the time that you spent at DPSA, were there occasions when Minister Malloy asked you to deal with certain tasks or certain issues or assignments as DG?
That was very, very rare, Chair.
Yes.
And that's when I talk about governance issues, it's essentially what the management culture was in the department. And I think the minister does make the same point in his affidavit that his style was about getting managers to report to him and all of that. And in my reply to what he says, I say it was not my view that the minister must not have any contact with managers, but that we needed to have a management process, proper management process, so that if he meets a manager to discuss certain matters, if something goes wrong, he can come to me and say, but I asked this person to do this, because I would not have been in the loop. But I found that it was a culture in the department, that the minister meets with all of these senior managers. Some of the examples would be that when I secure a meeting with him, when I arrive at his office, he'll be sitting in meetings with one or two of my officials. They'll be discussing operational issues. And part of me said, I must just accept this is how things happen. But another part of me said, ultimately, everything that happens in this department, I'm accountable for as accounting officer. And I just felt it was not sustainable. But in my affidavit, I also make the point that it was never and still is not my view that the minister must not have any contact at all. But that there needs to be parameters.
Some understanding
some
of how
policy
it
to
is
say
be
this
done.
is how things happen. Because, yeah, I can leave it there for now.
So you say it was very rare during that your stay at DPSA, or it would have been very rare that he asked you to deal with any particular issues.
It may have happened, but it was very rare.
Yes.
It was very rare.
Now, in the absence of that, how much work were you able to do on your own as DG of DPSA during that time? Were you able to call meetings of your staff and do what needs to be done, or that was difficult for some reasons?
Well, the way normal management meetings that took place, I think they happened weekly or fortnightly, I can't recall. So one was able to do all of those kinds of things. And what I tried to do was to make sure that those becomes the reporting loops. You know? So if somebody is at a meeting with a minister, they come and tell the team what they're engaged in and do they need support, direction, and all of those kinds of things. So we tried to introduce some process, but it was very clear in my head that it's not a sustainable way of managing a huge organization like that. And I thought I was going to be at risk as accounting officer, because if things happen or don't happen, I can't say as the DG, but I was not involved or I didn't know. Yeah, it will look very bad on me as a person.
What was the essence of the challenge? Was the source of the challenge the minister, Mr. Malloy, or was the source of challenge him plus your team, your staff, maybe when they were not accepting you easily because of how you came to the department, or where was the challenge?
Chair, I wouldn't want to attribute all of it to the minister. All I can say is that my analysis of the situation was that it was a management culture in that place, that there wasn't clarity about where does the minister's role start and ends, where does the DG's role starts and ends, and who takes accountability for what. To just give an example, I mean, when I was there, one of the major developments was negotiations with the unions about salary increments at the time. Meetings were held with unions and National Treasury to agree on what should be the increment amount for public servants. And there I was, as DG, not being part of any of those discussions, and getting to know that an agreement is being reached or negotiations are taking place, led by DPSA, with the unions, and I was reading about a lot of those things in the media myself. It's just one example, but I would say it's a culture that emerged, that I found in the department, and it may very well be that it was a culture that existed in other departments. I do not know.
Yes. Okay, all right. So one, you say you don't think the Minister Barlow had anything personal against you. That's one point you make. The other point you, I think, made was that maybe he was not so welcoming because of how you came to his department on your analysis. 3, you say, well, you had no problem in principle with him interacting with people under you. You just wanted that should be managed in a particular manner.
That's correct.
You were not just, you were simply not as involved as you expected to be involved as DG in matters of the department, operational matters of the department.
That's correct, Chair. The only addition I'll make to your summary is that if anything goes wrong,
yes,
I was going to be held accountable as DG.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. Just to conclude on this aspect of your time at DPSA, I understood your evidence earlier to be that you did not conclude a contract of employment for your time as DG of DPSA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there are things called performance agreements that seem, from what we've seen of these various matters, to be concluded between heads of department, which you were both at GCIS and DPSA, and the responsible minister. Did you conclude any such agreement insofar as your time at DPSA was concerned?
No, I did not have a performance agreement.
Thank you. Then, if we could go back to NN5, I was going to take you to a document there that commences at page 44.
Well, just one second again, Ms. Hofmeyer. Did you or Minister Malloy try to conclude the performance agreement or not really?
Not really, Chair. We did have a conversation about the need for such, but we just never got to it.
Okay, thank you.
Then we're in NN5, Exhibit NN5 at page 44, 44.
I got it.
Do you recognize that document, Mr. Maseko?
Yes, I do, Chairperson.
What is it?
This is a statement, a media statement that I prepared following the cabinet meeting that took place on the 2nd of February 2011. It announces all the decisions that were taken at that cabinet meeting. Importantly, the last one is the announcement of my departure from GCIS. And if I may read it, Cabinet noted that Mr. Maseko...
Mr. Maseko, sorry to interrupt, just to give the chair a reference. This is at page 48, 48. Is that correct?
That's on page 48, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That paragraph reads, Cabinet noted that Mr. Themba Maseko was to be redeployed to the Department of Public Service and Administration with immediate effect. Mr. Maseko will be replaced by Mr. Jimmy Manyi as the new GCIS CO and government spokesperson. And it is dated, okay, so it would be, I don't see the date here, but it was issued on the 3rd of February.
If you go to page 44, the first line there seems to confirm that. Can you read us the first line?
So it says, Cabinet held its, the very first line says, statement of the Cabinet meeting of the 2nd February 2011. And then first line says, Cabinet held its ordinary meeting in Pretoria yesterday on the 2nd of February. So the date of the statement would be 3rd of February. 2011.
Thank you. And Mr. Maseko, you gave evidence a moment ago that after the cabinet meeting, you returned to your office in the afternoon to start preparing the statement. Did I have that correct?
That's correct.
Your first affidavit before the commission referenced something else that happened during that afternoon of the cabinet meeting. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
What was that?
Okay. Do you have it? Which file was it?
Your previous affidavit actually has not been placed in your file because it is already an exhibit before. Indeed. So if you can just tell us what happened as well in the afternoon of the 2nd of February cabinet meeting.
Well, after the meeting, I had a meeting with Mr. Chabane just to confirm that this is the decision taken and that I can still proceed and issue the statement and handle interviews. The next step was to interact with Mr. Malloy, my new minister at the time, to agree on a time to meet, seeing that I would be his DG. Then the next task was to prepare the statement and make sure that it's done properly. And I had to find working space at the Union Building. It was allocated space. And I did still a few moments with the then Deputy President to just share some of these experiences with him ahead of finalizing the statement. And the statement was issued the following day in the morning.
Did you receive any call during the course of that afternoon?
Yes, I did, Chair. Other than the usual calls from the media to get confirmation before the statement, and I had to tell them what was going on. Then my office also called to say they are in a situation where they had calls from Mr. Manyi to say he was coming over, and they needed to know, do they give him access to the building, and all of that, because remember, this is just immediately after the cabinet meeting, and the matter was already in the media, so my office needed some direction about what needed to happen. So I just said, confirmed what was leaked in the media, that I was no longer a spokesperson. And I asked them to start packing my things because I was not going to come back. I never had the opportunity to sit down and pack my stuff properly, or even to have a staff meeting to explain to, or not to explain anything, but to just say goodbye to the staff. And that's how quickly the events unfolded on that day.
I think in your either statement or oral evidence, I'm under the impression that you did say that you had a meeting with a few members of your team after the cabinet meeting, where you just told them that you were leaving or you were being transferred. Now, but I don't know whether I'm saying you said that in circumstances where it may have been Ms. Pumla Williams who said you called a meeting in a boardroom that I think was next to your office or something at GCIS, and it was a few of them. You told them that you were being transferred or you were leaving. They asked you what the reason was. You didn't tell them. And she says it was a short meeting, and after the meeting, she followed you to your office, hoping to try and get more information. As I recall her evidence, she found you in your office at your desk with your head down, I think she said, which I think gave the impression that you were emotionally unhappy. You were unhappy, but she, I think, said she didn't get, you didn't tell her the reasons and so on. Is that something that you didn't say and maybe it was said by somebody else?
I'll have to check the records, Chair. I know that in the afternoon of these events, which was immediately after the cabinet meeting, there was no time, there was no opportunity to talk to my staff. And as I say, I needed to give direction to my staff about what needed to happen in the light of what was unfolding, and the events were unfolding very fast. So the priority for me was the cabinet statement, the deputy president, meeting with the, meeting with my new minister was coming. So on that particular day, the events were just too quick.
Okay.
I never had the time to go back to my staff to say a proper goodbye. I never had a chance to pack a lot of my things. My staff did that. It is possible that, in fact, definitely not on the same afternoon, but maybe in the following day, I might have gone back to my office. But I had a very close relationship with my staff. I would have loved to have a staff meeting and say a proper goodbye. It is possible that I might have called a few of my EXCO people subsequently, but there was never a proper formal goodbye to my staff.
Okay, I certainly got the impression from whoever gave the evidence that it was just a few people that you were able to call very quickly, but you might refresh your memory at some stage.
I can check on that, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
Chair, just to confirm, as I have it, that was the evidence of Ms. Williams before the Commission.
Okay.
Mr. Maseko, we are at, and Chair, we are at the ordinary time for the lunch adjournment. I have very few remaining matters to deal with, but I'm in your hands whether we complete that now or return.
Well, it would be preferable that we complete that now if we can, so that we can release Mr. Maseko, and when we come back, then we can, I can hear the evidence of the next witness. How long do you think your few questions might need?
Well, I'm anticipating my questions will not take very long, but I'm being signaled by my colleagues on the right who indicate that they may want to raise one or two matters. In the light of that, it may make sense to adjourn and then return?
I would prefer to avoid that if it's possible. I would imagine that they may have written questions on pieces of paper. Maybe they might just pass that on to you. I think Mr. Pretorius indicates that it might be possible. So that we can finish with him, if
Indeed.
possible, let him go, and then when we come back, we start with the new witness.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Chair, it appears that I'm going to be handed a computer, which may not be the easiest method. I wonder if we could possibly take a 5-minute adjournment so I can establish what the issue is and then conclude Mr. Maseko's evidence swiftly. I'm not sure if that will be suitable.
Yes, I'm just wondering if we are going to take 5 minutes, whether we shouldn't then just take the lunch break, because you might find that they have maybe a few questions that they would like to suggest, or Mr. Pretoria says it's 2 only. So let's take 5 minutes break and then come back and try and finish with Mr. Maseko.
We're indebted, Chair. Thank you.
It will be 5 minutes. We'll adjourn for 5 minutes. We adjourn.